Somewhere in the hills of southeastern Turkey, there is a structure that, according to everything we were taught in school, should not exist. It was carved before the invention of the wheel, before writing, before pottery, before metal tools of any kind, before, as far as we can tell, humans had even figured out how to farm. For most of the 20th century, the story of civilization went like this. Humans learned to grow crops that let them settle down in one place. Settling down let them build villages. Villages grew into cities, and only once you had cities, food surpluses, and organized labor did you get things like temples, monuments, and religion. Farming first, big buildings later. That was the rule. Nobody questioned it. Then, in the 1990s, a German archaeologist climbed a quiet hill that local farmers had been plowing around for decades because it kept snagging their equipment on buried stone, and what he found underneath that hill broke the rule completely. By the end of this video, you're going to understand why some historians describe this single site as the discovery that forces us to rewrite the opening chapter of human history. And I mean that literally. Not aliens built it. Not lost civilization. Just humans did something here that we did not think humans were capable of doing yet, at a moment in time when, according to our own theories, they shouldn't have known how. Stick with me, because around the middle of this video, I'm going to walk you through the actual physical evidence for why archaeologists think this place was deliberately buried, on purpose, by the very people who built it. And that detail alone might be the strangest part of the entire story. If you're into deep dives on archaeology and history like this channel puts one out regularly. So consider subscribing before we get into it. Now, let's go back to that hill in Turkey. The site is called Göbekli Tepe, which translates roughly to Potbelly Hill. For decades, archaeologists had actually surveyed the area and walked right past it. A previous study in the 1960s noted broken limestone slabs on the hill and assumed they were nothing more than a medieval cemetery. Unremarkable, not worth a closer look. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt was reviewing old survey notes from that earlier expedition and noticed something the original team had missed. The limestone fragments scattered across the hill didn't look like broken gravestones. They looked like pieces of large, deliberately shaped pillars. He traveled to the site himself, and within minutes of examining the surface debris, he reportedly said he knew he would spend the rest of his career there. He was right. When excavation began, his team uncovered not a small shrine, not a scattering of a few carved stones, but massive rings of T-shaped limestone pillars, some over 5 meters tall and weighing as much as 10 tons, arranged in careful circular and oval enclosures, buried under the hill for thousands of years. Now here's where the timeline starts to matter. Radiocarbon dating placed the oldest layers of construction at approximately 9,600 BCE. Let that sink in for a second. That is roughly 6,000 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza. It's older than Stonehenge by about 6,000 years as well. It predates the invention of writing, the invention of the wheel. And this is the part that really matters. It predates, by every measure we have, the beginning of settled agriculture in the region. So the question becomes unavoidable. If farming is supposed to come before monuments, how did hunter-gatherer communities, people who were still following wild game and gathering wild grain, manage to organize the labor, logistics, and long-term planning needed to quarry, carve, transport, and erect 10-ton stone pillars? To understand why this discovery landed like an earthquake in the archaeological world, you have to understand what the old model actually claimed, because it wasn't just a rough guess. It was one of the most foundational ideas in the entire field, sometimes called the Neolithic Revolution model. The idea, developed and refined over the 20th century, was straightforward. Agriculture is hard. Farming requires you to stay in one place, defend your fields, store surplus grain, and organize a community around a shared, predictable food source. That surplus, the theory goes, is what eventually freed up enough time and manpower for some people to stop hunting and gathering altogether and instead specialize. Builders, priests, artisans, leaders. Religion and monumental architecture, in this model, are a byproduct of agricultural surplus. Farming comes first. Temples come later, once you can afford them. Göbekli Tepe appears to flip that sequence on its head. The layers of construction show no clear evidence of domesticated crops or livestock at the time the earliest pillars were raised. The people who built this were very likely still hunter-gatherers, based on the animal bones found at the site, mostly wild gazelle, boar, and birds, not the domesticated herds you'd expect from an established farming settlement. So here's the question that keeps archaeologists up at night. What if the sequence is backwards? What if it wasn't food surplus that led to religion and monument building, but the other way around? Large groups of hunter-gatherers gathering periodically to build and worship at a shared sacred site. And it was that very gathering, feeding hundreds of workers over months or years of construction, that pushed people to start experimenting with cultivating wild wheat nearby just to keep everyone fed. If that's true, then this hill might not just be an old temple. It might be looking at the actual birthplace of the idea that led to farming itself, and by extension, to cities, to writing, to essentially everything we call civilization. If your mind is already racing with follow-up questions, good, because I've got a few more for you. But first, if this kind of weight that changes everything history content is what you're here for, now's a great time to hit subscribe, because we're just getting started. Let's actually look at what these pillars show, because the carvings are where things get genuinely eerie. Each T-shaped pillar is arranged in a large ring, usually with two larger central pillars facing each other, surrounded by a circle of smaller ones. Many of the pillars have arms and hands carved in relief along their sides, hands that appear to meet just below the belt line, as though the pillars themselves represent stylized human, or human-like, figures. Belts and loincloths are carved into some of them, suggesting clothing. Then there's the wildlife. Foxes, snakes, boars, cranes, scorpions, and vultures are carved across the surfaces in intricate, confident relief work, not crude scratches, but deliberate, skilled artistry. One particular pillar shows a vulture with its wings extended, positioned above what appears to be a headless human figure, an image some researchers interpret as evidence of an early form of sky burial, where the dead were left exposed for birds to consume the flesh before the bones were collected. Here's a question worth sitting with. Why animals? And why these specific ones? Predators, scavengers, venomous creatures. Not farm animals. Not friendly, docile symbols. If this was, as many researchers believe, a ritual or religious center, what kind of belief system centers itself around vultures circling the dead and snakes coiled at the base of human-shaped pillars? We don't have an answer. There's no written language at this site to explain the symbolism to us. We are reading pictures left by people who had no writing, trying to reconstruct a belief system that vanished more than 11,000 years ago, using nothing but the stones themselves. Now here's the detail I promised you earlier, the one that might be even harder to explain than the age of the site itself. At some point, roughly 1,000 or more years after each enclosure was built and used, the people at Göbekli Tepe didn't abandon it, didn't let it fall into ruin through neglect, and didn't destroy it through conflict as far as the evidence shows. Instead, they filled it in, deliberately, on purpose. Enclosure after enclosure was packed with rubble, broken flint tools, animal bones, and soil, essentially burying the pillars they had built, and then building an entirely new enclosure nearby, only to eventually bury that one too, generation after generation. Why would you spend possibly years quarrying, carving, and raising 10-ton stone pillars, only to intentionally bury your own creation once it had served its purpose? A few theories exist. Some archaeologists suggest this was a ritual act of closure, that a temple's active lifespan was considered finite, tied to a specific community, generation, or purpose, and once that chapter ended, the structure was ceremonially retired, the same way some cultures ritually decommission sacred objects rather than simply discarding them. Others propose it may have been an act of renewal, clearing space and materials to build the next monument as older ones lost significance, or as new symbolic pillars needed to be erected for a new purpose we can't identify. And then there's the far more practical possibility that this deliberate burial is actually the reason Göbekli Tepe survived at all. Structures left exposed to 11,000 years of weather, earthquakes, and human reuse rarely survive intact. But a structure buried under meters of packed rubble and soil is protected, sealed away almost like a time capsule. If that's true, we owe the discovery of the world's oldest known monumental architecture to the fact that its own builders decided to hide it. Either way, ask yourself this: what kind of belief system requires you to build something monumental, and then, without destroying it through violence or simply neglecting it, choose to bury it with your own hands? If you're finding these open questions as fascinating as I do, drop a comment with your own theory. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe, because we've still got some of the biggest implications of this discovery left to cover. Let's talk about the logistics for a second, because this is where the hunter-gatherer label starts to feel almost inadequate. Quarrying a 10-ton limestone pillar out of solid bedrock using only stone tools is a massive undertaking on its own. Then that pillar has to be moved, likely dragged over land using ropes, wooden sledges, and a coordinated team of dozens of workers, possibly over a distance of several hundred meters from the quarry site nearby. Then it has to be raised upright and set into a socket cut into bedrock, without cranes, without draft animals confirmed to have been domesticated yet, and without a system of writing to coordinate the labor across what may have been months or years of work. That level of coordinated effort typically implies some form of organized leadership, or, at minimum, a shared belief powerful enough to convince large groups of mobile hunter-gatherers, people who normally spent their time following seasonal game and wild plants across a landscape, to stop, gather in one place, and commit enormous amounts of time and physical labor to a shared project with no immediate, practical survival benefit. So who organized this? Was there a religious leader or a council of elders coordinating between different hunter-gatherer bands who otherwise had no reason to cooperate? Was this a seasonal gathering site where multiple otherwise separate groups met periodically, the way some later hunter-gatherer societies are known to have done for trade, marriage, and ritual? And Göbekli Tepe was simply where those seasonal super-gatherings happened to leave permanent stone evidence behind? We genuinely don't know. What we do know is that whoever organized this effort managed to do something that, according to the old model of civilization, should have required farming, food surplus, and permanent settlements first. They appear to have done it without any of that. Here's where the story gets even bigger, because Göbekli Tepe isn't alone. In the years since Schmidt's original excavation, archaeologists working in the surrounding region of southeastern Turkey have identified a whole cluster of similar sites, now often referred to together as the Taz Tepeler, or Stone Hills. One of them, called Karahan Tepe, located not far away, has produced its own set of T-shaped pillars, along with a striking underground chamber containing rows of carved phallic pillars and a large carved human head emerging from the bedrock itself, staring out from what may have been an underground ritual space. Ground-penetrating radar surveys across the wider region suggest that Göbekli Tepe itself may only be a small fraction of what's actually there. Some estimates suggest the majority of the enclosures at the site, potentially dozens more, remain completely unexcavated, still buried under the hill, waiting. Which raises an uncomfortable question for anyone who assumes we've already found the important stuff. If a single hill in Turkey was overlooked for decades, misidentified as a medieval graveyard, and turned out to contain the oldest known monumental structures on Earth, what does that say about the rest of the region? What does it say about the rest of the planet? How much of what we consider the beginning of civilization is actually just the beginning of what we happen to dig up first? If that thought gives you a small chill, you are exactly the kind of person this channel is made for. So if you're not subscribed yet, now's a good moment, because we've got one more layer to this story, and it's the part that actually matters most for how we think about history going forward. For most of the last century, the story of human progress was taught almost like a straight staircase. Hunting and gathering, then agriculture, then villages, then cities, then writing, then monuments, then what we'd call civilization in the fullest sense. Each step unlocking the next one in a clean, linear sequence. Göbekli Tepe suggests that staircase might actually be closer to a loop, or at least a much messier, tangled set of parallel developments. Belief, ritual, and large-scale cooperative building may not have been the reward for civilization. They may have been part of what caused it. The desire to gather, to build something meaningful together, to mark a sacred place, may have come first, and the practical technologies, like farming, may have developed afterward, almost as a side effect of maintaining that gathering. This isn't a fringe idea anymore. It's discussed seriously in mainstream archaeological journals, and Göbekli Tepe is now taught in many university courses as a case study in why the old farming first model was probably too simple. That's an enormous shift for a field that, for most of the 20th century, treated that model as close to settled fact. And that's really what makes this the discovery that changes everything. Not because it proves aliens or lost super civilizations or ancient technology beyond our own. It doesn't need any of that. It's extraordinary specifically because it shows that hunter-gatherers, people we used to imagine as simple, scattered, and purely survival-focused, were capable of large-scale cooperation, symbolic thought, and monumental engineering thousands of years earlier than we ever gave them credit for. The story isn't that history is stranger than we thought. It's that the people at the very beginning of that history were far more capable, organized, and driven by belief than the textbooks ever gave them credit for. Let's bring together everything we don't actually know, because it's a longer list than what we do know. We don't know exactly what belief system drove people to carve foxes, vultures, and snakes into 10-ton pillars. We don't know exactly who organized the labor, or how they convinced mobile hunter-gatherer bands to cooperate on this scale. We don't know, with certainty, why each enclosure was eventually deliberately buried. We don't know how many more enclosures remain unexcavated beneath the hill, or beneath the dozens of related sites nearby. And we don't know how many other Göbekli Tepes might be sitting under other hills in other countries, simply because nobody has looked closely enough yet. What we do know is that a hill, once dismissed as an unremarkable medieval cemetery, turned out to hold structures older than farming itself. And that discovery alone was enough to force a serious rethink of one of the most basic assumptions in the story of human civilization. Maybe that's the real lesson buried under that hill in Turkey. Not that ancient people had secret, advanced technology, and not that history is hiding some grand conspiracy. The lesson might be simpler and honestly a little more humbling. That the people who came before us, even the ones we assumed were simple, were capable of complex belief, cooperation, and ambition long before we thought they were, and that the beginning of our own story is probably further back and far stranger than any textbook currently admits. So here's a question worth sitting with after this video ends. If a single hill, misidentified for decades, rewrote the opening chapter of human history, what else, right now, is sitting under some other quiet hill somewhere, waiting for someone to notice that the broken stones scattered across the surface aren't gravestones at all? If this is the kind of history that keeps you up thinking, that's exactly what this channel is built around. So subscribe, turn on notifications if you don't want to miss the next one, and let me know in the comments. Which unanswered question from this video do you think is the most important one to actually try to solve?